If you want the perfect home viewing experience for classic TV shows, movies, and of course, video games, you'll need many display types. Of course, you'll need a basic CRT, but a professional monitor provides a really unique experience. And an HD CRT would both be needed for 480p and up, but you'd also need a PC CRT monitor to supplement for higher resolutions and refresh rates. At least one projector type would be needed for a movie theater feel, and for that to look even remotely good, you'd need a quality screen, not the garbage I have here. And if you really want to cover all ground, you'd probably want a CRT projector as well. Unless you work with older electronics for a living like I do, or you're a hardcore fan of all of this stuff, going out and buying all of that equipment would be pretty ridiculous and really expensive. So what if I said you could use an OLED combined with a RetroTink 4K to emulate some of the unique aspects of those experiences, while also having a display that does an excellent job with modern content? And what if I said adding a Philips Hue lighting system to your TV could tie it all together to make your setup feel a bit more cinematic? With last year's OLEDs dropping in price to make room for next year's coming in, I figured now was a great time to teach you how to do all of that, all for less than the price of just one large calibrated professional video monitor, for some context here. So let's jump in and take a retro enthusiast's look at the LG C4 OLED. Before we jump into the retro stuff, let's quickly go over some of the basics. First, for modern TV and movies, setting the C4 to filmmaker mode is basically all that's required. Unlike older TVs, you don't have to dig into each submenu every time you change your resolution, which was a massive pain. Vincent Teo from HD TV Test recently posted a quick setup video for this exact model that goes into a few more settings you might want to change. I definitely recommend watching that video, but just know that simply setting it to filmmaker mode is really all you need to worry about, including for 24p sources, which is a nice surprise. Of course, for gaming, always make sure it's in game mode. I also suggest switching to the HDMI input you're using for gaming, then going to Settings, General, External Devices, and HDMI settings. Set 444 pass-through to on, and I assume turning on quick media switching is a good idea as well, although let me know in the comments if there's any negative effect for that. Then go to HDMI Deep Color and make sure it's set to 4K for that input, so no colors are compressed. While the 444 setting should persist, these TVs remember different settings for each resolution, refresh rate, and input, so you'll always want to double check it's in the right mode. Simply hitting the settings button on the remote brings up that menu, so I just do it every time I start whatever content I'm displaying, just to make sure. Here's some handy tips RetroRGB viewers sent in. First, quickly pressing the green button on the remote 7 times brings up more detailed info about the signal being sent. It seems to work fine with HDMI sources, but I don't think it works with any of the built-in apps. Speaking of those, you could access them from the home screen, which is a bit busy. So to disable them, go to General, System, Additional Settings, and Home Settings. Disable both Home Promotion and Content Recommendation to make the home screen a little less noisy, and if you'd rather not see the home screen at all, you could go into Power On Screen and set it to just boot to the last HDMI input it was in. I'm keeping it on the home screen because as of now I'm still using the built-in apps, but it is still a bit noisy. At least nothing's flashing at your face like before though. Please let me know in the comments if you know of any limitations with these apps, or if there's a reason to use an external box instead of the built-in ones, at least at this time. That's really it to get started for basic viewing. If you'd like, you could reference ratings.com and their YouTube channel to check out calibration recommendations and get all the details on this TV. Both Ratings and Vincent do excellent work, so I'd rather send you to their respective sites than try and pretend I'm a calibration expert. The rest of this video is going to go into a little bit more advanced stuff that we as retro gamers would be interested in, and to accomplish that you're going to need a scaler. I'm going to show a couple of different ones here, but I'm really going to focus on the RetroTink 4K, as I really think that's the perfect match for this TV. Just a few more things to note. I bought this TV as an open box deal, as honestly that's the only way I could afford it, and I don't think I ran into any problems related to it being used, but I wanted to put that out there in case someone notices an issue that's on this that's not on their C4. Oh, and I'm not being paid in any way to make this video, but LG, if you want to send me next year's TV as a sample so I can start testing, I would be totally open to that. All kidding aside, I am going to be leaving affiliate links for absolutely everything I can in the description because that and monthly support is the only way this channel could stay alive. All right, let's jump in. Well, this is RetroRGB, so I'm going to jump directly into lag testing, but this section is going to have a ton of flashing lights on the screen, so if that type of stuff bothers you, just check the on-screen note and skip directly to that to get to the conclusion of what I found. Starting out, sending the C4 1080p 60 while in game mode results in about 9 milliseconds more latency than you would have seen on a CRT, which is excellent for a big TV like this. We could also confirm this TV draws its image top to bottom as expected, so the lag rating will be the same on either side of the top. Now let's enable black frame insertion, which is annoyingly buried in a menu that can't even be pinned to favorites. Bring up settings, then click on the picture mode and advanced settings. Then wait for that to load, which for some reason takes a long time. Then go to clarity and scroll down to true motion. I have no clue why this isn't just an on-off switch since there's only one option, but select user selection and toggle the OLED motion button to enable it. And yes, there really is only one option, on and off. You get nearly nothing for BFI controls on the C4. Turning it on adds one full frame of lag to the signal, bringing it up to about 25 milliseconds. That's not bad, and better than a lot of older OLEDs in their regular mode, but you might want to use other options for BFI. I'll explain why in a bit. Next, 720p 60 shows the same 9 milliseconds as 1080p. Just a quick reminder that it's very common for TVs to buffer a frame or two when switching resolutions to try and reduce the amount of time you wait before the TV is done switching. That's why you might see it say 25 milliseconds for a second or two, then drop to 9. Don't worry, it's just 9. If you send it a 480p 60 signal in 16:9 mode, it's also 9 milliseconds, but setting it to 4:3 in any mode still seems to have that one frame of lag issue that previous models had. I'm not sure why this happens, and the total lag is about 26 milliseconds. I want to pause for a second and clarify that this extra latency will only ever occur if you have to manually switch the TV into 4:3 mode. That means if you're using any scaler or even those classic retro emulation consoles that take a 4:3 image and output it with black bars on the side, then you'll never run into this issue because you'll actually be sending your TV a 16:9 image, which I'm going to be showing very quickly here in the next part of this section. But anyway, let's move on to the next resolution. Sending in a 480i signal resulted in about 34 milliseconds of lag, or about 2 frames. This was the same regardless if it was 4:3 or 16:9. The only default setting that's on with 480i is super resolution, and that, as well as the others, didn't seem to make any difference in lag results. So if you'd like, try sending 480i games to the C4 via maybe something like the OSSC's pass-through mode and see how it looks. If you're playing a turn-by-turn role-playing game or something where lag isn't crucial, maybe the TV's deinterlacing will provide the look you're going for. You could insert BFI too at the cost of another frame, but I don't want to spend too much time on this as I really think most people will be using a scaler with 480i games anyway. Oh, and the C4 doesn't accept 240p at all, which is expected. I also wanted to see if adjusting the sharpness on a 1080p signal would affect lag, and it doesn't at all. Remember that in the next section. Also, there's about 1 milliseconds of difference between the TV's dimmest and brightest setting. However, that could just be a result of how the sensor on this lag testing device works. And you'll never use a TV's lowest brightness setting anyway, even in a room with no other lights. So I'm still calling this a 9 milliseconds lag TV in 60 Hz mode. The LG C4 has a panel that natively runs at 120 or 144 Hz though, so I wanted to see how sending a signal through a RetroTink 4K would change these readings. It's showing just over 11 milliseconds of lag when the RetroTink 4K is outputting 4K 60, and if we go into the Tink's Scale and Crop menu, you'll see it's listing the added latency in Genlock mode at 2.5 milliseconds, once again proving that the readings in this menu are accurate. A total added video latency of just over 11, that's TV and scalar latency combined, is actually very good. But I wanted to see what happens when we use the Tink to send the C4 one of its native refresh rates, 120 Hz. You'll see the TV's buffer add some lag for the first few seconds, and then the lag drops back to about 9 milliseconds. You could even add the Tinks BFI in any combination and the lag doesn't change. As long as you're in Genlock mode with normal options enabled, setting the TV 1080p 120 is the same latency as if you were setting it 1080p or 4K 60. The next section will show why this is a really important point. One other thing to note is turning on either of the Tinks HDR settings seems to add a frame of lag unless you also enable VRR. As long as your source has a VRR enable flag, this will never be an issue, but it's something to note. Just remember to toggle VRR on along with HDR for gaming. Okay, so after a ton of testing, I could say that the LG C4 is a low latency display when set to game mode, and the only issues to worry about are you're going to get an extra frame of latency if you have to have the TV process the images 4:3, or if you add HDR without VRR. So just always use a scaler for 480p sources and make sure to flip on VRR if you have an HDR gaming source. Now let's talk about gaming, and I'm mostly going to focus on retro gaming as there's plenty of other reviews of modern gaming on the C4. And I'll jump right in with OSSC compatibility. As you can see here, this TV is accepting a Super Nintendo signal using optimal timings in 1080p 5x mode with no problems at all. And if you're not into CRT mask emulation and don't mind using the C4's BFI, or no BFI at all, this is a perfectly good experience. In fact, turning the sharpness up in this TV provides a really good experience with 2D retro graphics when sending it a 1080p signal. So if you have an OSSC, RetroTink 5X, or a Mister, this is still an amazing TV to use with not much else required. Just dial in your normal settings and turn the sharpness up. Let's dig a bit deeper into sharpness though. I did some basic testing and it looks like turning it up all the way with 1080p sources does a really good job. I mean, it's not the same as using the Tinks to send a native 4K signal, but if you decide to run your 4K Tinks at 1080p 120, this is a great result. More on 1080p 120 in a bit. I was curious how the C4 sharpness would compare to something like the 4K Gamer Pro sharpening. It's not quite as sharp as the first setting on the 4K GP, but at least there's no ringing like with the second and third setting. If you already own a 4K GP and something like a RetroTink 5X, keep using it, but definitely do not go buy one if you're using a C4. This TV sharpness is good enough with 1080p and retro graphics. It wasn't perfect at all resolutions though. Raising the sharpness with 1440p sources added the same kind of ringing you'd normally see with sharpness on flat panels. So if you're connecting a device that can output 240p stuff as 1080p or 1440p, here's yet another reason to use 1080p 5X. So while the LG C4 isn't doing a nearest neighbor integer scale from 1080p to 4K, it certainly feels like I'm looking at 4K 10x when viewing at a normal distance. 720p was okay with the sharpness up, and there didn't appear to be any ringing. If you have any of those HDMI-based classic software emulation consoles, it'll probably look fine with the sharpness up, but it's not as good as with 1080p sources. And turning up the sharpness was just okay with 480p, but between that and the 4:3 lag issue, I'd say use a scaler for all 480p sources. I mean, if you're on a budget, bought your TV first, and plan on getting a scaler later, sure, send 480p directly and deal with the extra latency and the not as great video processing. But it's my strong opinion that if you've spent this much money on such a nice TV, you should eventually upgrade to some scaler, at least the original OSSC. One cool trick, you could add the sharpness setting as a favorite to make it easy to access. Just hit the settings button on your remote, then click the little pen icon in the upper right. Hit the plus button to add a new link, then just click on Adjust Sharpness. Back out, and now whenever you hit the settings button, it'll be right on the menu. I'm much more likely to use a feature if it's not buried in menus, and I'm glad they made this one of the settings you could pin to the main settings menu. Okay, now let's take a look at what the RetroTink 4K can do when paired with the LG C4, as it offers some really cool options. The first thing I'd like to show is the CRT mask emulation. My favorite 4K mask at the moment is this one made by Kuro. I'll leave a link to his latest version in the description. Then, of course, I'll set the input, switch it to Genlock, and enable VRR. CRT mask emulation never looks right over streaming video services, but in person, this is nuts. Also, even though this is Kuro's FV310 profile, it looks more like a BVM on this display. But it's important to note that each mask profile will look different on every panel and panel size, so you'll have to experiment yourself to see what's your favorite. This one certainly comes to a Pro CRT look on my panel though. Here's where things get interesting for RetroTink 4K owners. If you have VRR enabled, LG's built-in BFI won't be available as an option. That means you'd either have to turn off HDR or deal with the added lag of both the C4's BFI and HDR. But let's check out what's, in my opinion, a much better option. I'll start by loading the default profile, then I'll set the HDMI output to 1080p 120 with Genlock, VRR, and HDR on. Now I'll enter the black frame insertion advanced setup menu and enable it. And please note that I'm recording a 120 frames per second TV with a 60 frame per second camera, so this is going to look terrible. Anyway, if you're not in a bright room, you don't even need the brightness up that high, but now turn the TV's sharpness up to compensate a bit for the lack of 4K. As a note, the 4K Gamer Pro won't work with 120Hz signals, so that's not an option here. This is basically the same result as the TV's BFI, but at 1080p and no added latency. Still the 9-ish milliseconds I showed before. And even if you run the Tink 4Ks in modes that add a bit more latency, it's still, in total, lower than using the C4's BFI. Now, let's add a CRT mask though, and you should probably turn up the OLED panel brightness for this. I hope the talented profile makers will create more specifically for 1080p 120, but I'll just make my own real quick. Oh, and a quick aside, it's so easy to lose hours of your time dialing in your favorite settings. Try not to obsess about this, and remember that the goal is not to see the CRT's mask. The whole purpose of adding these is to cut through the retro graphics in the same way a real CRT would have. So concentrate on the image, not the mask, when dialing it in. So after testing, you'll want to see which looks best to your eyes on your TV. The Tink set to 4K and either no BFI or your TV's BFI, or the Tink set to 1080p 120 and using it for everything. Now, of course, an OLED could never truly replicate the look and feel of a beam of light being fired at the back of a CRT's thick piece of glass, but this combination comes really close to essentially looking like a high-end multi-format professional monitor. I'll be honest, standard one-on, one-off BFI can often look really flickery to me though, especially with a big TV. I imagine it's much better with 240Hz TVs where the flicker is reduced by 1/4, but if you have the RetroTink 4K Pro, there's another BFI option to try, Blurbuster's CRT Beam Simulate. Simply go back to the 4K Pro's BFI menu, then switch the blending mode to CRT Beam, then play with the beam steepness and phosphor glow options. This CRT Beam BFI only blanks half the screen at a time for 120Hz output, and it uses a soft edge. That reduces flicker and raises the brightness, making it a bit easier on the eyes than standard one-on, one-off BFI like the C4 uses, but you'll have to see how it looks on your TV to your eyes. If you see some dark horizontal bars after enabling CRT Beam BFI, either set both the input and output gamma to 2.4 or just enable HDR. Adding HDR is probably a good idea anyway for classic gaming with either CRT mask emulation or BFI, as it'll brighten the image up. Honestly, I think BFI is going to be something that looks much better with 240Hz displays. I'll be going over BFI in great detail in a future video, and I'll make sure to include 240Hz, but for now, just try it and see what you think. As a note, while I've been showing 240p input examples, you could even get an HD CRT look with 480p sources as well. You'd just want to switch to the RT4K's built-in 1440p 120 mode, as CRT mask emulation is pretty uneven with a 480p to 1080p scale. The mask won't be as detailed as with 4K output, but you'd still have the option for both BFI and mask emulation, and overall this looks amazing. And of course, you could always use a 4K mask and just use the C4's built-in BFI at the expense of one frame of lag, or just don't use BFI at all. It's really whatever your eyes prefer for that game. So look, hardcore retro gamers will always want to keep their CRTs, but buying a RetroTink 4K Pro and a C4 OLED is still far cheaper than buying something like a multi-format production monitor. Plus, you get perfect geometry and the ability to do things most CRTs can't, like auto-zoom a game that doesn't fill the screen vertically. And while not perfect, this overall experience is really close to a CRT. The last thing I want to mention in this section is TV size. And while I'd personally always end up with a TV that's a little bit too big rather than a little bit too small, you'll want to remember that if retro gaming is your focus, those games were designed to be played on 20 to 27-inch TVs. So going to a 77 might not be the best choice for you. For me personally, I found that this TV is awesome, but my old couch is a little bit too low to the ground, so my head isn't centered in the middle of the screen like I would normally prefer it to be. And I would rather just get little risers for my couch than end up with a smaller TV, but I wanted to tell you that just so that you could visualize your setup, where you're going to be gaming, and make sure to pick the right TV size for the content that you're viewing. Just wanted to add my thoughts there on that one. Now switching over to movie and TV content, the LG C4 plays 24Hz or 24p content perfectly as long as you're in the right mode. When in standard mode, there's some crazy interpolation and 3:2 pull down happening. But when set to game or filmmaker mode, 24p content is simply played 5 frames at a time. That means just by keeping it in filmmaker mode, there's no 3:2 pull down or judder at all, so 24p content looks the way it should. So if your focus is modern content, this TV does great all on its own. That said, it often feels like modern OLEDs are almost too good for older TV shows and movies, often putting dirty film or film grain front and center. This might not bother most people, but if you've ever had the luxury of viewing old content in the proper cadence on PC CRT monitors, you'll most likely prefer that look. But I'm sure you'd much rather have it on a big OLED instead of a small, older monitor. And if you see a lot of film grain in your older content, the first tip I can give you is make sure the TV isn't too bright for the room. This may seem kinda obvious to some people, but if you're in a dark room, just turning down the OLED brightness helps to make film grain blend in better, and that might be all some people need. But if you own either RetroTink 4K, you could take it one step further on the C4, and CRT mask emulation does a really good job with older content. Before I go any further, I want to address a question I get all the time. Why would anybody want to take a movie and put a CRT filter over it when movies were always designed to be watched on projectors? And the answer is, the goal of all of this is to trick your brain into thinking that you're having a classic viewing experience, even if it doesn't line up to exactly what it would have been back in the day. And here's a perfect example of that. I had a DLP projector for a while that I really loved using for older movies. It wasn't nearly as clear as an OLED, and my pull-down screen is really crappy, but it felt like I was at a movie theater, even though DLPs don't work anything like a 35mm projector. They use a spinning color wheel to display each frame 3 times, and your brain stitches them together to make one image. My guess is the image being displayed on a screen by a flickering light, combined with the sound of the projector working, simply tricked my brain into thinking it was more movie-like, even though it wasn't at all an accurate recreation of a 35mm projector. So just like using a modern DLP projector to feel like you're watching an old projector at a theater, we're going to use CRT mask emulation to try to make this OLED feel like you're watching older content on older displays. To do this, start by creating 2 mode lines, one that's 4K 24 and another experimental one that's 1080p 144. As a note, the C4 can handle 144Hz across all HDMI inputs, but all previous LG OLEDs maxed out at 120. Also, I recently went over what proper 24-frame cadence is in a previous video and exactly how to make these mode lines. I don't want to waste your time repeating that info here, so please check that one out if you haven't already. Now that you've added the mode lines, start by loading the default profile to clear any previous settings. Then switch over to the 4K 24 mode you just created and make sure frame lock is enabled. No need for VRR with this configuration. Now I'll go to the Processing Effects menu and dial in a high TVL CRT mask. And as I said before, the goal isn't to see the scan lines, but just to have them cut through the image. That's even more important now, as you really want the mask emulation to just disappear. Please remember that CRT mask emulation always looks terrible on streaming video services, and will look worse if you're not watching this in 4K on an OLED TV, but I want to show this anyway. Here's the image side by side with and without the mask emulation. In person, this effect looks much cooler, so I'll switch over to Kuro's profile that has a bunch more settings implemented and HDR enabled, which will be a lot more noticeable on camera. The blurring Kuro added looks really cool in person when viewing at a normal distance, and also using the Tink's SDR to HDR conversion definitely helps compensate for brightness. However, adding any mask will mess with the colors a bit. You'll have to experiment with this on your exact panel and mask, but there's tons of color options on the Tink that can help. You could also try switching the C4 to game mode, but it's usually best to just stick with filmmaker mode for everything that's not a video game. Also, like with video games, you'll get a more even CRT mask for 480 sources if you use 1440p. When going to 4K, the uneven mask isn't that noticeable, but simply setting the Tink to 1440p 120 and making sure frame lock is enabled will get you proper 24p cadence with totally even CRT masks. You might be thinking, okay, I'm sure the Tink 4K's CRT mask emulation looks awesome, but can I add the TV's BFI to it as well, since lag doesn't matter with video content? You can, but note that once you enable the C4's BFI, it automatically converts 24p sources via 3.2 pull-down and treats them as 60p. I didn't think this was too bad, but I showed it to a friend who immediately said the flicker was giving him a headache, and this same person also kind of liked the 60 to 120 Hz BFI when used with video games, so he wasn't just somebody that was sensitive to BFI strobing. I really think LG dropped the ball with this one though, as implementing some pretty cool 24p BFI could have really added to this TV. As a note, if you're watching progressive scan TV shows and going for an interlaced look, there's a few more things you could do, but use the Tink's normal triple buffer and 4K 60 output for those options. It'll result in 3.2 pull-down, but that's what you'd have seen on a CRT anyway. Then go back to the Processing Effects menu and enable Pseudo Interlaced. You could choose between bobbing the progressive scan file between 4K lines, which works great for 1080p stuff and really gives off the feel of a CRT. You could also drop it to a 1080i simulate, but you'd lose some video information with 1080p sources. While I don't use this feature too often, I do like it for TV shows on Blu-ray that really benefit from a CRT look. And if your source is 480i, you could actually take this a step further. Just a note, you could probably take that 480i image and use IVTC to revert it back to something like a 480p 24 source, but some TV-based content does feel better interlaced if you're using the right processing modes. Here's a good example. A while back, I watched The Godfather Saga on Betamax. I watched parts on a consumer CRT, as well as some professional video monitors, and all were unique and awesome experiences. See, while The Godfather was a movie meant for cinemas, this Saga was edited specifically for home viewing on 4x3 CRTs, and the film of that movie is especially messy, so a CRT really felt like the perfect match for it. I still have a VHS copy of that Saga, and using the Tinks to build a CRT simulate mask really brings back the feel of watching it on a CRT. Even the RetroTink 5X can do this. Once again, I don't add interlaced simulation often, but sometimes it's just the perfect fit. Okay, now I want to show you how to use the RetroTink 4Ks to add black frame insertion to 24p sources utilizing the C4's 144Hz mode. Now, this is actually really tricky because 24Hz strobing is awful in most configurations. I'll get into that in the upcoming BFI deep dive video I'll do, but just note that this isn't a perfect scenario, it's just something that's really fun for people who already own the RetroTink 4K to try. First, load a default profile on the Tink to clear any recent settings. Then set the HDMI output to the 1080p 144 mode we created, and make sure both frame lock and VRR are enabled. If you get a lot of video dropouts, you could switch to Gen Lock, but frame lock is recommended for faster syncing of frames. And after the Tink is running in 1080p 144, set the C4 to filmmaker mode. For some reason, I get glitches in game mode with 144 BFI and 24p sources. Who knows, maybe a TV firmware update will fix this at some point. But anyway, now go to the BFI menu and disable the LCD saver. While it's required for LCD displays, it's not needed at all with OLEDs. Then leave all the other settings as is and set strobe to 3. For the record, it looks super flickery here because I'm recording a 144Hz display at 60Hz, but it does not look like this in person. In fact, on my C4, this mode helps the film grain to blend in a bit better, and I don't notice the BFI strobing nearly as much as I do with 60 to 120Hz BFI. What this is doing is displaying each frame 3 times with a black frame in between each. So that's 24 times 6 to 144. I saved this as a custom profile and use it anytime I watch older TV shows or movies with lots of film grain to see how it feels. I did notice some weird blips or glitches in this mode, but I've watched complete movies this way and it didn't really bother me. And to be honest, sometimes the blips just made it feel even more like an old movie like you'd see with dirty film through a projector. You're welcome to try any other combination of BFI, and you could even tweak it to simulate the exact flicker you'd get with an old 35mm projector. In fact, if you want both BFI and CRT mask emulation for sources lower than 1080p, you could use this 96Hz strobing by simply creating a 2560 by 1440 96Hz mode line. And while the flicker is more noticeable than in 144Hz, that could potentially be a great combination for 480i sources you've inverse telecine to 480p 24. Once again, check out that 24p video I did for more info on that. And for the record, the C4 doesn't seem to be compatible with any combination of 1440p 144, so that's not an option. As a note, you could also combine the 1080p 144 BFI and scan lines with 1080p sources, but adding a 1080p mask to a 1080p source will cover up some of the video information. On the flip side, mask emulation is never an issue going from 1080p to 4K, as it's both an even scale and you don't lose any information this way. The mask mostly just cuts through the doubled pixels. Overall, I think most people would prefer the CRT mask emulation over the 144Hz BFI, and definitely do not go buy a Tink 4K just to try the 144Hz stuff, but if you already own one and get a C4, you really should give it a try. I'd be willing to bet there's at least a few scenarios where you'd prefer it, so try it out and save a profile with your favorite settings. Luckily, you can make as many profiles as you'd like with the Tink, so test all these options, then save and rename them on the SD card. While it's sometimes a pain to make these profiles, you can just assign them to buttons on the remote to enable them with one press. That means after you're done, you can seamlessly switch between these different video modes and experiences with just one button push. Now onto the part of this video that surprised me the most, the Philips Hue Lighting system that attaches to the back of your TV. I've been curious about it since it was first released, but never liked that you had to connect all your sources to their expensive HDMI box and switch inputs there. After I saw that Philips launched a Hue app for LG TVs that didn't require an HDMI box and even worked with built-in apps, I was ready to finally try it, and I was really impressed. In fact, I liked it so much that I even bought 2 Hue bulbs for the back of my room as well. Here's what you need to know. First, you need a compatible TV, which I believe are 2024 and up LGs, and I think some Samsungs as well. Definitely check their site if your TV isn't a C4 or newer. Then, just download the app and sign up for either $3 a month to use it, or buy the app outright for $130. While that's not cheap, remember that their modern HDMI box is $350, so you're still saving quite a bit. Next, you'll need a Hue Smart TV color light strip, which are so much more expensive than I expected. I almost bailed after seeing the price tag, but it was worth it. Installing that is super easy. Just place one clip in the top middle of your TV via the built-in double-sided tape, then find the arrow in the middle of the light strip to center it. Then just place the other clips around the TV and snap the light strip in. I have a mild case of OCD, so I measured and placed them all around at the exact distance from the edge, but you probably don't need to be as exact with it. You'll also need a Philips Hue bridge to wirelessly connect the light strip. It's the exact same bridge all Hue lights use, so maybe you have one already? If you plan on also getting bulbs like I did, you might want to look for a pack that includes both the bridge and color bulbs to save some money, but that's up to you. Installing the software was super easy and took less than 5 minutes. I don't want to bore you with the step-by-step, but just follow the instructions to create both Philips and LG accounts, then download the apps on your TV and phone. The only snag I ran into is at one point it said, wait, your TV will restart, but it never did, it just hung there. So all I had to do was power cycle it and was able to pick up the installation right from there. While the basic setup was straightforward, I did run into 2 unintuitive issues that I think are worth knowing. First, open the Hue app on your phone, go to Settings, Entertainment Areas, and click on the area the app had you create for the TV's lighting. Then go to When Sync Stops and set it to Off, so that your TV's light strip will automatically shut off when you power off the TV. Also, adding extra bulbs to the room you created is super easy in the Hue app, but adding them to the TV's lighting isn't very intuitive either. Start by adding the bulbs to the room you created during setup, then go to Settings. Click on Entertainment Areas and tap on the new area you created. Then hit the plus and select the lights you added. Drag them around to match the location in your room as well as the height from the ceiling. They'll flash when you click on them, so you'll know which is which. Then hit Done when you're finished, and that's it. Since you've added them to your room and entertainment area, they'll automatically sync to the TV. As a note, you won't need the phone app at all after installing unless you want to access the lights separately. And I think loading an app just to turn on a light is absolutely ridiculous, so I bought a Hue switch as well. I was able to configure it so when I turn the switch on, both Hue bulbs are all white and at the brightest settings. And here's the best part. It doesn't matter if you turn on the bulbs with the app or the switch, or if the bulbs are off or powered on. The next time you turn on your TV, it'll just automatically sync. I don't think I'd have liked or even used the rear bulbs as much if this wasn't the case, and I'm really happy it works this way. After setup, use the LG TV's Hue app to adjust it to your liking. The intensity setting changes how drastic the lights change based on what's on screen, as well as has a starker contrast between different sides of the TV. After playing around with it during different content, I think I prefer this always left at moderate, but who knows, my opinion might change as time goes on. Figuring out brightness is as simple as matching it to the ambient light in the room. In complete darkness, I like this set to 30%, but if it's a bright day and the windows are open, I'll crank it up to 100. I have it all the way up here just so you could see it better in this video. There's a game mode that has it react more quickly to what's on screen. Also, it seems to concentrate on matching the colors around the center of the screen instead of the edges like with movies. No lag is being added to the game itself, so just use whatever setting looks best to you. I think the reason I like the Hue TV lighting so much is that I almost never notice it. Which I know is a weird thing to say. Why did I spend a ton of money to buy something I don't notice? But that's kind of the point. When there's a dark scene in a movie, the lights automatically dim, so it doesn't look like I left a lamp on in the room, which would be throwing off extra brightness in dim scenes. And on the flip side, during bright scenes, the Hue provides ambient light at the correct color for the moment. Having extra light in the room means your TV won't act like a giant flashlight into your eyes, and it's better than just leaving a light on since the color matches. So much like CRT mask emulation, for me personally, the best settings are as high as you could set it without really noticing it's there. The only downside I found is the Hue lighting gets really weird when you enable the RetroTink 4K's BFI in any mode or setting. It doesn't seem to change if you're using the C4's BFI, but if you're using the RT4K's BFI, you might just want to turn Hue off altogether. Adding a CRT mask didn't affect the Hue in any way though. Even with this limitation, I'm still happy I bought the Hue setup for my TV. And I know the Hue lighting isn't for everyone, but if you have a TV that supports the Hue app without the need for the expensive external HDMI box, you should at least consider it. I really don't think I'd have bought it if I needed that external box, but I'm really glad I had this set up to use with this TV. It just makes this office, guest room, home theater feel that much closer to a dedicated home theater room. Look, this TV is beautiful. It's the second best display I've ever owned, second only to the BVM D32. And the latency bugs are definitely weird. There shouldn't have to be an extra frame of latency for 4:3 mode, or really even having black frame insertion added. And also, their lack of 24p BFI was super disappointing, but none of those things would deter me from buying this TV, and I'm really glad that I picked it up. And sure, you could always wait around to see what's coming next, and the G5 OLED is supposed to be pretty amazing, and heck, even last year's G4 OLED is even better, but both of those are a lot more expensive, and this one is available right now. So my suggestion to you is this. If you have a 2020 or newer OLED that you like and there's nothing wrong with, probably just keep it, and I don't think there's anything about this TV that would make you want to upgrade. But if you don't have any OLED at all, or if you have one that's much older than that, now is probably the best time to upgrade, both for price and just because this is an awesome TV. Anyway, if you liked this video, please consider subscribing to the channel, and there's plenty of ways to support even more, including ones that are completely free. Clicking on the RetroRGB support page and scrolling down will bring you to affiliate links that let you buy stuff from Amazon at the exact same price, but we get a small cut. Just click that link before going to your cart to help us out. If you're not super into this stuff but feel generous, maybe leave a tip directly through PayPal or Ko-fi. Even the smallest tip is appreciated, and links are on that same page. And if you rely on info like this, please consider signing up for monthly support services like Patreon and Floatplane. We recently turned off all ads on RetroRGB to make the experience better, but there's no way we could have afforded that without amazing monthly supporters. And of course, we have some fun RetroRGB merch available too. If you want to broadcast to everyone around you that you're a fellow CRT nerd, check out that link as well. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.